Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and this is my January wrap-up and February TBR. If you've seen part 1 of my January wrap-up, you know that I've split this into 2 bits, so this is officially part 2. I have just as much to say about these books as I did for the original ones, so let's get started. Then I read Liberty Boy by David Gaughran. Liberty Boy follows an Irish boy named Jimmy O'Flaherty during the Robert Emmet Uprising of 1803 in Georgian Ireland, specifically Dublin. Basically the story goes that Jimmy's trying to save up money to take himself and his mother to America because he's sick of British rule in Ireland. But rebellion happens and so does a girl, and the story just kind of goes from there. I thought Liberty Boy was interesting because I didn't know anything at all about the Robert Emmet Uprising, and I knew very little about the state of Ireland under King George's rule. Interest aside, I couldn't really get past the fact that the story felt more like an essay than a novel. The pacing took me out of the story. There'd be elements and things that I think would have been wonderful expanded upon that just sort of fell flat when they were summarized, and there were things that were expanded upon that should have been summarized because they didn't really serve the plot. So that was a bit of a bummer. As well as the misogyny and slut-shaming presented by Jimmy. I get that he's a 19-year-old boy living in 1803, but there was a sort of hypocritical attitude he had where he wanted the one girl in the story that wasn't a direct relation to him or over the age of 40, right? So he really wanted her and wanted her to be with him, but he consistently disregarded her wishes about what she wanted to do with her own life. And the moment he thought for even a second that she was up to some perhaps more sexually open shenanigans than he thought was acceptable for a woman of the time, he immediately wrote her off as a whore, and without even asking her about the situation, and assumed that being a whore was the absolute worst thing a woman can be, and just wrote her off as a person because of it. And we're supposed to sympathize with him. It's like, oh, but I'm in love with her, but she's a whore. And there was this whole back and forth that he had in his brain that I just didn't buy and didn't sympathize with, because get your shit together. So didn't like the pacing very much. I didn't like the execution of the story, and I really didn't like the male main character. I also really didn't like the love interest, not for the reasons that Jimmy felt conflicted about her. I just didn't like that she was very much a not like other girls girl, and that sort of thing drives me absolutely crazy. I gave Liberty Boy 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I wanted to throw it back to an old, middle school, early high school favorite. When I was in late middle school, early high school, I was part of this site called Figment. It was basically a site where authors and aspiring authors could put their work, and members of the community would read it and comment on it, and they could watch these different works grow. Unfortunately, the site has been shut down, but one of my favorites from the site was Vein of Love by R. Scarlett. When I found out the author had actually published this work, I had to pick it up right away and see if it was as edgy and romantic as I remembered. Vein of Love follows Molly Darling, a New York socialite. Molly is a daemon, spelled D-A-E-M-O-N, not demon. And yes, the distinction does matter. Who has sort of super strength and kind of just is superhuman, and you can tell she is what she is when you look at her eyes, which are this mix of blue and super white, so they're really, really pale. And it follows her as she meets in her adult life Tensley Knight, a demon to whom she's been engaged since she was 5 years old. So despite Tensley's jerkish behavior at first, the two sort of grow together and are drawn together in a way that I personally find really sweet. That being said, there were things that I didn't recognize or realize when I was younger that kind of bother me about the story now. There's a sort of obsession with female purity in this book, especially tied to the female character's sexuality. Molly is very much considered not like other girls because she's still a virgin at age 19, whereas her frenemies are pretty regularly put down for having had a lot of sex, though in the narrative they also put her down for not having had sex. It's a little bit of a mess. In addition to that, there's some really concerning discourse about the ownership of female bodies. So when I read, I have different rules for certain fantasy creatures. So demons and vampires and werewolves don't follow the same rules that I would keep in place for humans. So the idea of Tensley owning Molly because of spoilery reasons that I won't get into. It was kind of iffy for me at first, and additionally Molly's behavior didn't make much sense to me this time around. Her wants seem to flip-flop depending on what will cause more conflict at that moment, and as such her characterization and her character development don't make much sense to me. It's still cute, it's still kind of sexy, and it's very, very nostalgic for me, so I gave Vein of Love 2.5 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read in January is one that has taken BookTube by storm, and I'm not surprised at all, and that is Cruel Prince by Holly Black. The Cruel Prince follows Jude, a human girl and one of a set of twins, during her adolescent life in fairyland, where she was swept away along with her half-fairy, half-sister because her half-sister's father murdered her parents. If you're already intrigued, you're in good company. I'm not going to go into much detail on here because I feel like going into The Cruel Prince or any Holly Black book at all is best if you do it knowing as little as possible so that everything surprises you. Oh, it's so shiny. Look at how shiny that is. I love this cover. If you've read anything else by Holly Black, I think The Cruel Prince just absolutely blows all of her other writing out of the water. And she is one of my all-time favorites. Like, Fairyland, as I think of it, is always Holly Black's Fairyland. I was actually lucky enough to get to meet her, and she signed my copy, guys. I told her about the awful Tithe fanfiction I wrote when I was younger. Tithe is her first YA fairy series that I highly recommend you read because some of the characters make cameos in this little thing. And she was super sweet about it, and it was actually really just lovely to meet her. I don't believe Holly Black can do anything not well, particularly when it has to do with fairy. I'll go more into depth about my thoughts in my spoilery review coming up very, very soon for The Cruel Prince, but I will let you know that I gave it a 4.5, maybe even a 5 out of 5 stars. I'm not entirely sure yet. And that concludes my January wrap-up. Because this video is getting pretty long anyway, I'm gonna just briefly mention the titles that I'm gonna want to read in February. As I already said, I've started school, so my free time is considerably lesser than it was throughout the month of January. And I also don't really want to have any strict guidelines about what I'm going to read. So this TBR is sort of the short list. I'm definitely going to be picking up, or at least trying to pick up, more books than the ones I mentioned now. The first book I want to get to in February is Grimm's Fairy Tales by, obviously, the Brothers Grimm. I am most of the way done with this one, so I'm going to be trying to finish it up throughout the month of February. Then I'm going to be picking up a really big one and trying to clear out my physical TBR with The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. It's all about Arthurian legend and strong female characters, so I'm really excited to get into this one. Next up on my list, or I guess it's more next on my TBR because the author is coming to Boston and I really want to have read this by the time I meet her. But it's Jane Unlimited by Kristen Cashore. If we're talking shiny covers, I think this one's got every other book in the world beat. I loved Kristen Cashore's Graceling trilogy, and this is the first book she's put out since then, so I'm really, really excited to get to it. And the last book I want to plan to read in February is Sight Witch, the novella companion to the Truth Witch series by Susan Dennard. In all likelihood, I'm going to be rereading these books again because I'm absolute trash for the Witchlands, and I also want to do a little bit of a review of these before Sight Witch comes out, or maybe after I'm done reading it, so a series review so far. That's all very much still like in the works in my head, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. Regardless, I'm really, really excited to get into Sight Witch. Alrighty guys, and there you have it, my January wrap-up and my tentative February TBR. That's all I have for you today, and I can't wait to see you next time. Goodbye!